We know it's been a long day, so I'm going to do my best to get out of the way of these guys because I think they have a lot to share. And just in terms of our prep call, it was some interesting facts. So Mark, you want to give a quick introduction and then go to Eric, and then we'll dive right into it?
Sure. My name is Mark Podorsky. I like to say I grew up in the energy industry. Started in gas and oil, moved through to electricity as the markets deregulated, and found myself immersed in the culture and what I like to think of as the challenges of the industry. And I do want to say that my years in the industry have taught me one thing, that we don't know what we don't know, and you never know where the market or the customers are going to take you. So I love the industry. I'm encouraging my son to get in the industry. People think it's not glamorous, it's not exciting, but I love it. And so I love opportunities like this to challenge software developers and be as disruptive as possible, because I do think the next generation of kids of the world are going to make it disruptive.
Okay.
Well, I did my quick introduction before. I'm noticing that Mark is using his high school picture like I am too still.
Wow.
But I think this idea, and we're going to get into it here in the conversation about what we don't know and how we move big masses of people, is a really interesting idea. So I'm going to, just as totally off script, I want to do a survey. Okay, so this is a participation survey to get everybody's blood pumping before lunch. So raise your hand if you wear a seatbelt when you drive a car. Fantastic. Okay. Now leave them up. Now, if you were born after 1978, put your hand down. Okay? So for those of you that your hands are still up, how many of you have wore a seatbelt when you were a kid in the back of the station wagon? One guy. We have one conscientious citizen. All right. So here's my point. As a society now, we just wouldn't think to get in the car and not wear a seatbelt, right? It's what you've done. Yet all of us, certainly folks of a certain age, all grew up at a time when we didn't do that. So how did we as a society within a generation change the mindset, and because seatbelts existed, by the way, it wasn't that we didn't have a seatbelt. How is it that we changed an entire society's view on something as kind of everyday part of your life as wearing a seatbelt within one generation?
Crash test dummies, that's what comes to mind.
Crash test dummies. Yeah. Crash test dummies were a part of it. And the other thing was, after years of trying to get adults to think about seatbelts, we realized that didn't work. So what did we do? We educated kids. And the kids educated the parents. So the parents started to wear the seatbelts because the kids said, "Mom, Dad, what are you doing? You gotta wear a seatbelt." Because we learned about it in school. So just as we think about this outreach thing, we can't think of it as something that is gonna take a day and we're gonna get it done, and then we say, hey, we made everybody smart yesterday. We have to recognize how these things shift, and seatbelts are my goofy example I came up with. We could do recycling as well. And how did we get to a place where less than half a generation ago, we didn't recycle at all? And now, I don't know about anybody else, but the garbage can at my house, that the city picks up is tiny, and we just had to get a bigger recycling one and a bigger composting bin. So we've shifted the way that we take care of our garbage, and we've done all of that within half a generation. That's really a 10-year-old phenomenon. And so I just would use that as a thought starter to get us going.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so let me poke Eric, because it's always great to poke Eric. But I will say, when I'm in a car and I think about it, yes, seatbelts have been around. My counterpoint will be, yes, but don't car manufacturers also have responsibility? Cars have been around for hundreds of years now. The best idea you can come up with is a seatbelt. At some point, they had to come up with airbags. I remember watching a movie, I forget what it was, Sly Stallone, where he was a cop in the future, and on a collision, there was like foam that came out and created like this foam barrier, right, that protected people. So yes, I think, totally agree with you. Kids are going to be their drivers and push the parents, which is where I think the industry will go as well. But I think manufacturers, whether they're software manufacturers, device manufacturers, I also think they have to start thinking outside the box to get past, hey, look, we got seatbelts. This is a great idea. Right? There's always something better.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
So how do we, to get to the innovation we want, it can't be iterative, right? And in the call, hope is not a strategy.
Right.
So what do we need to do to make that giant leap from iterate, and hope that something changes we're not going to hope for a disruptor to come in as we talk. So we're not going to wait around and say, hey, we want an Uber to come in and change our industry. So what needs to happen, or maybe ask a different way, what's the problem that we're not doing right now?
So I'll go first this time, and then Eric can poke me if he wishes. So I like to really think outside the box and say, why are we sitting up here trying to solve it? We should have a bunch of 15-year-old Gretas up here. Oh, which, by the way, I don't know if you saw the news, she's up for a Nobel Peace Prize as well today. She was nominated. So my point is, you only know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know. And recently, I was in Geneva, Switzerland, and I'm kind of a math geek, so I wanted to go to the CERN and see the super collider. And what was interesting to me is I only know math, physics, and all the things I know because somewhere somebody taught it to me, and I read it in a book. But when I was doing the tour, there was an 18-year-old kid, he reminded me of Sheldon Cooper. He had his 18-year-old girlfriend, and he was trying to explain particle physics to her and how things collide. And he was coming up with new questions and new ideas. He's like, well, if the atomic weight started as this and then the atomic weight started as this, how do we bend it and get it to collide and then we get more atomic weight? Somewhere there's something out there, right? And the more questions he had, the more thought and different answers they had to come up with, right? And this was an 18-year-old young man talking to his girlfriend. Now, he was talking about to try to impress her. I don't know if that worked or not, but it provoked a lot of thought, and it made me take a step back and go, man, I only know what I know. I only know what I was taught in a book. These kids are asking the questions and looking for different answers. And so, you know, I think, first of all, to your point, we have to look to the next generation, the kids that are really impacted, the Gretas of the world, and say, what is it that drives you? What makes a difference to you? How do you think we can solve this? And get more of them on these types of panels and discussions.
Yeah, well, I certainly think, as I said earlier, that getting everybody rallied around this kind of healthy level of dissatisfaction and just the awareness is the first step. Will it come as a big bang, or will it come as an iterative process? I don't know the answer. I'm not the typical trajectory, if we believe the technology is at the core of it, is that it's very hard to predict how things get used. Sometimes for good, sometimes not for good. But once you put the tools out in the world, their use and their evolution will happen. People will innovate and be creative. You know, the idea of if you go back to when the iPhone first came out, remember, it wasn't an open ecosystem for app development, right? You know, Apple was going to have all the good ideas. And that very quickly changed to, once you put the basic tool and the platform out there, then you created this app economy. And there's all sorts of things. Some of them are real, some of them are goofy, some of them are productive, some of them are just entertainment. But we did that because we kind of crowdsourced the answer, right? Anybody could go off and develop apps. So for me, I think, you know, it's interesting listening to the last panel because I think we have to acknowledge that there's a structure in place today, a regulatory compact in place today, and for most people, that's really, they live in an area that's controlled by that, so you can't just wish that away. You have to recognize that that there's some interplay between the way that the regulation and the rules go and the way that energy, water, and these other services have been provided, because it is a very heavily regulated industry. Maybe that won't be true. I love Manoj's water filtration system. Maybe that will be kind of a leapfrogging technology in some places. But I suspect that even if you took a look at how that would play within say, California here in the United States, somebody very quickly is going to say, but what's the regulatory treatment and how does that work? So one thing that I would propose, my little card idea, is I think for a relatively small amount of money, 1-2% of utility revenues should be set aside for a kind of no-risk innovation fund. Because one of the things that happens today is the way that regulation gets made and the way that rates are set, there's this very heavy tension. If something's approved, then there's a huge amount of risk on the executor, in this case the utility, to deliver, right? If they don't, then they say, well, then I'm going to penalize you, and that's kind of counterintuitive to the way that the innovation I think we need in the industry works. If you can't take the risk, if as entrepreneurs, SEW or any other company here in the Valley, if the risk of failure is super high, then people don't take risk. And so we have to find some mechanism to create a pool of money to allow innovation. And it doesn't all have to be the utility. It could be third parties. It could be public-private partnerships. But we have to find some way to juice up the innovation engine.
Any ideas there? Follow up?
I'm going to go back to a point that was made earlier. It's the cycle of educating, awareness, and engagement. And I want to go back again to the younger generation and education, right? If they don't know what a kilowatt hour is, if they don't know what a gallon is, if they don't know what the price is and how you got to the pricing in those models, then they're just looking at numbers. And, the closest they get to knowing the impact of their consumption is when, their dad says, close the dang door, I'm not paying to cool the outside. So I think the more that you can educate them early, the more I think they can start understanding and thinking about different ways to conserve or consume. I think the other thing that I would stress is, again, they're outside the box thinkers. We think about moving water through pipes with electricity and pumping, or moving electricity through poles and wires when, probably 100 years ago now, Nikola Tesla proved that you can move electricity without poles and wires, right? But, Edison had a lot of money behind his ideas. He had a lot of patents behind his ideas, and he had friends in high places, right? So there's reasons that things happen. But if you get outside the box thinkers like this, you start saying, hey, look, let's get the kids involved and let's do some customer journey mapping and say, if we're going to build an area or if we're going to stress the new home builders, let's think about how we can maybe get water or power that's indigenous to the area. So, let's think about geothermal, or let's think about solar, and let's think about these things where I can reduce the amount of energy I need to pump the water if I have a more local solution, or I can reduce the amount of energy consumption or the transportation cost because now I'm creating, a microgrid, whether you want to call it a microgrid or a community aggregation of some sort. But, I think when they start thinking about the impact and the different ways you can move power or water, and maybe what are some of the better ways to conserve, they might start thinking outside the box and think about, how do I do this better, cheaper, faster?
So I'm hearing is, to get there, we needed the blocking and tackling of greater education. Right? And the next step would increase that pool of interested people looking to solve big problems And that's not a technology problem, that's a way we engage and educate. So anything to add there?
Yeah, well, I
Eric?
think
That was part
that-
of your presentation.
Yeah, but I think what we find is that if we create transparency in the system, if people knew where the costs were and where the problems were, and we get that education, the innovation comes, right? I don't think we have I don't think we have an innovation problem. I don't think there's a lack of smart people who want to work on these problems. What you will hear from the entrepreneurial community, and this is probably even more so true in water than it's been in energy. I can line up 100 venture capitalists who say nobody ever makes money in water, right? There's no money to be made in creating technology in the water industry.
And I would argue, should they? Is water a resource that should be had?
Well, there's a different problem. If you want to drive innovation into the market, there's got to be an opportunity for people to create new technologies and sell them and build a business. If you don't have that adoption cycle of new technologies, then people aren't going to spend money to go innovate in that space. It's that simple. So we have to recognize that there are cost structures, unintended consequences, as the last panel said. Maybe the better idea than running wires to parts of rural California would be to create microgrids that are solar and battery based and drop those in. Maybe that's the better approach. But if the regulatory construct and the regulatory environment that we live in sets up an incentive for people, maybe like Edison, to say, hey, listen, there's a lot more money in running pipes and wires to those places, then that's going to be the incentive that drives the behavior. So create information, open the thing up, and kind of crowdsource the solution, and I think you'll get plenty of innovation around it.
And I think, no, I mean, it's a very valid point. And 1 or 2%, dedicated to R&D certainly can hurt, because then you can't afford to make mistakes and keep going, and I think that's important. I think the other piece, though, is, I talked a little about the influence of regulators in government, but, to have them step up and play not so much the role of tell me how you want me to do something, but come up with ideas because this is the goal and this is what we're trying to do, and then put some policy and standards behind it. You talked about transparency and openness and sharing ideas, or having technology talk to each other. We're talking to different cities. One of the cities we were both in recently, San Antonio, the city of the future. Bridgewater Consulting Group as well as SEW are working with the folks out there to say, what does that look like? And there's this convergence of information across water, gas, electric, whatever that may be, in different IoT devices that can help deliver all that information, right? But at some point, without open standards, without communication, without interoperability, none of that stuff comes together. So I do think there is, a role for regulators in this as well, to help push and drive us towards those standards and interoperability, so that all that information can come together easily and give everyone transparency.
I'm going to follow up on that pace. So the conference that he's referencing was 2 weeks ago. So one of the actually elected officials brought this up, and then maybe just posing this is maybe that's part of the challenge, is because they're driven by election cycles. So no one really wants to be the one to drop the ball, but we have to take a longer term approach. So you allow them to take the risk, and yeah, there may be some things that go wrong, but because it is so election driven, nobody ever wants to drive innovation on the regulatory side. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I think it's. I agree with that. I think that because there are elections, you can look at what's happening in, say, in Ontario, Canada, right now. So, I don't live in Ontario. I don't have a dog in this fight. But the government, the new state, provincial government, was elected in no small part because of a promise to lower electricity prices by 17% or some such number. 12? Bob will know. 12%. So 12%. So, did they have any clue of how they were going to do it? No. Did they have any idea of what the consequences of that would be? Probably not. Sounded good. They probably pulled the question, and now they got to go deliver that. And what are the unintended consequences? Both in my suspicion is what will happen is they'll pay for it by mortgaging the future. Somebody will look at it and say, well, now we've made the political promise, so we got to go deliver it. How are we going to do that? Well, let's as came up on the last panel, let's short sheet the infrastructure investments. Let's not do planned maintenance. Let's defer anything that we can defer, and then we'll make all the numbers kind of work. And that'll be fine today, and then by the time we get to the next government, the next round of, I think it's 5-year cycles in Ontario, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think it's 4, but then somebody will come up and they'll say, holy cow, we have a real problem because we weren't doing maintenance for or not enough maintenance for the last 5 years. So I think that's where you got to put it off in a bucket. And I'm okay, by the way, having the bar be high. As you look at the two innovations that Manoj showed this morning, those are big ideas, right? Those are swing for the fences, needle moving ideas, and that's okay. And hey, they could have worked hard at it and failed, right? You take that risk if you head down that path. And I'm not suggesting that we would let utilities or anybody else in the process off the hook for delivering. I just think you've got to create some mechanism to take some small portion of it and put it off to the side, and let people know that there's some at-risk money, and if you framed it up that it's a certain amount of money, then why not?
In there, Mark. We have about 5 minutes, a few minutes to see if anyone had a question for Mark or Eric. Lance?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We've talked about a lot of stuff this morning. I have to tell you my list is getting long. We've talked about a lot of stuff this morning. I have to tell you my list is getting long about talking about. But we've talked about the invention of things that we need to move forward. We've talked about
Many interested parties in working together to create this collaboration and do all of these things. But one of the things on my list is take the first step, is to move forward and do something. And I think when we talk about regulations or where things will stop, and we look at what Manoj has been doing and those things, there are many things that don't require us to go anywhere to do. If I come up with a device that works and we can place it in a home, then it doesn't need anybody else but a buyer for that, or someone just to accept that, use it so that it works, and then translate that to others to say, look what we're doing. So what do you see, kind of, Eric, I know we've worked together on this and other things, but the rest of the panel to say, how do we bypass certain stuff? How do we leapfrog from technology to technology instead of saying, oh, there's a domino that has to fall first or other things like that? How can we be so active today to create change in a very short period of time?
Just from my response, you have to create a panic or a sense of urgency to do it, and you wouldn't want to be. Traditionally, the U.S. is very reactive, especially being in Texas, where we've been hit with a lot of hurricanes recently, and that enacted a lot of strong. You can't go anywhere in a utility in Texas, and the message is, oh, it's resiliency, and that was as a function of the hurricane. So, and that has created a lot of initiatives that weren't being talked about 2 years before that. So one, you have to have something that creates that urgency, and you don't want it to be a natural disaster.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's a great quote from Jurassic Park: "Nature finds a way." In this case, I think disasters or a need, a critical need, always pushes innovation. And we as a country, as a group of people, as human beings, I think given any crisis or catastrophe, we always seem to find a way. And I don't want it to be a catastrophe, but I do think we are in a crisis, and I think that is going to drive it. But I do think there is going to be an iterative cycle. Somebody's going to come up with the iPhone, and then somebody's going to make it better, and then somebody's going to find a way to repurpose it. But you've got to be willing to take that first step, and you got to say, look, I know this is different. This isn't moving water down a pipe. It's drilling a hole somewhere and come up with a better way to filter that doesn't require me to, pump it from a treatment center. Something, whatever the case may be, I think we'll find a way, but somebody has to take that first step, and we do have to put something out there that somebody else can look at, leverage, and make better. We're always building better mousetraps, so, I think it still is that first step, and then we're going to make it better.
Another thing, there was a utility executive that said, hey, someone needs to build a test grid that we can go and play on and do an experiment on, like a true test bed grid. And so if anyone has some land and wants to build them, I mean, that's what his thought was, because so you can do those and test them in real time without
Did you say a test grid?
Test grid, yeah.
So why does it have to be a grid? I mean, and that's right. So that's where I'm going. I think you need to go outside of traditional, this is what we know and this is how we move power, right? Again, if you get back to let's bring the younger generation in, let's think outside the box and do that customer journey, because I don't think we should start with this is what we do now, how do we make it better? We have to say, let's pretend we don't know how to move power. Let's pretend we don't know how to produce and move water. Let's start from scratch and not just see that there's a better way from the start.
Well, I would say, just kind of back to the theme of our conference, this is about customer-centric innovation. So, it's maybe a little bit biased, but our view is you put the information in people's hands. You got to we've spent 100 years building a system that said, customer, don't worry about it. People don't understand what a kilowatt hour is. They don't understand how they don't know how to read their bill. We haven't done a whole heck of a lot to make that bill understandable. The amount of cross-subsidization that's happened in the industry for political reasons in part has created all sorts of bizarre distortions in terms of the way things go. So you got to kind of clean that up, make the information available, and then let people innovate to it, and they'll go solve the problems. Okay. The alternative, and the way we've done it in the past, is we just come in with another regulation or another incentive to try to compensate for the bad unintended outcome of the other regulation that we did before, and it creates these odd things. So, and that can work, by the way. I think EV adoption in California, which of course has been great, take away high occupancy vehicle lane access and see how many electric vehicles we would have sold.
Okay. Well, with that wraps up our time, but we did want to end our panel with the call to action, and Eric kind of alluded to it, but you want to say, well...
Yeah, so that's mine. My call to action would be, as a society, would we take 1-2% of utility revenues that would create a real pool of money, and designate that into, I don't want to call it R&D because I don't expect the utilities to do R&D, but allow them to do experimentations, new customer offerings and new things. And it sounds like a crazy idea. There are countries where this already exists. Yeah.
Well, that's it, panel. It's been great. Do you have any?
No, I think we talked about it before. My point was we've got to get the next generation involved. They're going to be the creators, thinkers of outside the box ideas. So I do think we need to start early with education them, teaching them what a kilowatt hour is, and I truly believe they will take it from there. I probably maybe am one of the few that has faith in the next generation.
There you go.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone. Chris? Oh, that was fun. Thank you.